Future of Trade. My name is Ian King. I'm business presenter of Sky News. We have a very distinguished panel alongside me who I will introduce very briefly before we get some opening words from our friends at DMCC. On my far right is Simon Williams, Chief Economist for Europe, Middle East and Africa at HSBC. Next to him, alongside him, is Alex McIntosh, the UK Chief Executive of YouGov. Next to him, Baroness Wheatcroft, a distinguished financial journalist, member of the House of Lords and a stalwart of many boards, both UK and international. Next to me on my left is Dr. Eleni Gabri-Madan, founder of the Ethiopian Commodities Exchange. Next to her is Chris Whiteside. He's Chief Executive of Inchcape Shipping Services. And last but very not least, Gautam Sashital, who is Chief Executive of DMCC and our host today. Now, before we get going on the panel, I would like to welcome the DMCC Executive Chairman, Ahmed bin Sulayem, who we will be able to hear from, if not see.
To the future of trade. We are live from Dubai and London. Please welcome our distinguished panelists and audience. I also want to welcome those watching by webcast. For today's event, we have viewers from Stern School of Business in New York, the SP Jain School of Global Management in Mumbai, Sydney, Singapore, and Dubai. And thanks to our partners, Oxford Business Group, we have viewers all over Latin America, Eastern Europe, and beyond. And Future Agenda, who have brought an audience from London, Hong Kong, South Africa, and India. Here in Dubai, we're grateful for the participation of New York University Abu Dhabi, Professor Christian Hebke, Head of Economics. Last but not least, I want to especially thank Astrolabs Dubai and the Campus London. Both ventures are Google Tech Hubs. And to us, it is organizations like this that truly represent the future of trade. Places that promote innovation, enterprise, and commerce with a focus on technology are what the future of trade is all about. Right now, we make a distinction between companies that do business digitally and those that do not. Our research shows clearly that those lines are blurring. In the very near future, all companies, at least the successful ones, would be 100% digital. Companies from the far corners of Africa and Asia to the hard cities like Dubai and London will pursue digital strategies to develop business and prepare for the future. That is what we are here to talk about today. So before we get started with the panel discussion, let me hand over to the DMCC CEO, Gautam Sashital.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. My mic doesn't work, unfortunately, so I might have one of the roving ones. Thank you. Well, thank you. Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Ahmed, for that introduction. Your Highness, Your Excellencies, distinguished panel here and in Dubai, and to all our listeners here as well as across the world, it's wonderful to have you with us today. So, why are we doing this? DMCC is the Free Zone of the Year. We won that award from the FDI magazine. And in a lot of ways, DMCC is at the center of trade, both physically in terms of our location in Dubai, as well as in terms of what we do with the trade. We have over 11,700 companies and growing at 150 companies every single month across a range of industries. We also work with various commodity-related industries, precious metals, diamonds, tea, agri, colored stones, you name it. We're working with all various commodity sectors. So therefore, understanding how trade is going to look like 10 years from now was extremely important to us. And so we teamed with the Future Agenda, which is the world's largest open source platform, to start this journey for where trade will go or how trade will look like 10 years from now. We started that journey in London, the old trading center, which has been established for the last 200 plus years. And that journey took us across 5 cities in 3 continents, and we brought it home to Dubai then. And basically, that journey included some 150 plus individuals who worked with us in workshops in these cities, academics, economists, intellectuals, regulators, and so on. And that journey became a conversation, which became the report, The Future of Trade, that we've published today. Incidentally, you will see that report at futureoftrade.ae. So really today, we're talking about the report and the outcomes of that, and look forward to the debate. Thank you very much.
Well, let me start with you, Gautam. What are your perceptions of world trade right now? We hear a lot about a global slowdown. Has that come through to you in the work and the research that you've done in putting together this report?
Well, is it working? Yes, I can hear it now. So basically, looking at all of the, let's look at how this report was synthesized first. It was based on several workshops that happened. And one theme that emerged out of this is that future of trade will be very heavily influenced by digitalization. And so we used CEBR to do some more analysis on what the impact of that will be. Now, moving back a bit to the trade itself, for the last 4 decades until the Great Recession, global trade was growing at about 1.5 times the rate of growth of GDP. But with 2008-9, that was broken, that trend was broken. Now, recently, some statistics were published for 2015 by the Netherlands Bureau of Economic Policy, which said that in 2015, global trade in US dollar terms dropped by 13.8%. In volume terms, though, it grew by 2.5%, whereas the global economic growth for 2015 was 3.1%. So really, the question for us was, where is trade going in the next 10 years? Will it continue at that sort of sub-GDP growth phase, or is that going to go back to what it was in the last 4 decades?
Very good. Well, that brings us neatly onto the first topic for discussion, which is the impact of digital on global trade. This report has never, the impact of digital on global trade has never really been looked at in such depth as there is in this report. So we really want to get into the issue here of how businesses are adopting digital strategy and how, in particular, that is driving imports and exports. And Alex, I'd probably like to start with you on this one. Obviously, the Future of Trade report has discovered that this is going to be a major driver of economic growth, but how do you see it actually being achieved?
I have to start with, I'm in a lucky position in which we are an online market research company, increasingly becoming a data technology company. So we have no legacy offline systems, which means we're much more flexible. I work in an industry which, by its very nature, used to be very offline, physically pen and paper, physical interviews, that type of thing. Digital has done a huge had a huge impact on the industry in terms of disrupting and also now creating lots of new opportunities. For us, the ability to essentially digitize the entire production of research has meant we could capture efficiencies of scale against our competitors in the UK in the first part and grow quite rapidly by being able to provide faster, higher quality research. But increasingly now for us, because we can do it in a consistent way, we can now follow our clients globally. And now, using the same model, we're able to open up a country. Currently, it seems like we're doing it every 6 months. We're able to use it as a template for growth that is outclipping the market research industry as a whole. So for us, it's been a massive sort of driver of our growth.
Simon, how difficult is it as an economist to measure trade flows when so much is going into a digital environment? I mean, the Office for National Statistics here in the UK has really tied itself up in knots with measuring some of this activity.
No, it is notoriously difficult. If you take the IMF's Directory of Trade Statistics, the Bible for global trade flows, you'll find that imports and exports don't actually match, which tells me at a global scale that something has gone wrong. I think many of the parts of this report are fascinating, and the impact that digital is having, not so much on global trade, but on the way in which businesses function. Again, I think is key. But I'd actually take a step back, and I'd say that the future of global trade is actually tied very closely to the future of the global economy, and the outlook for that global economy has taken a significant leg down since the Great Recession. That period of exceptional trade growth that we enjoyed in the decade up until the Great Recession, I think, was driven by some very particular factors, especially in emerging markets, particularly in China and the integration of global supply chains. That's what drove global trade on as strongly as it did over that phase. That phase is done. We're in a different cycle, and we can sense that global trade is slowing very quickly. I think digital is part of the response to that, but it's only part. I think there are still a whole bunch of old school issues that matter just as much. Improvements in regulation, the big regional trade agreements that are being designed. These things are key, and within economies as well. It's not enough to have a website and PayPal for trade to actually work. You need emerging market economies that have reached a level of sophistication and development in terms of their infrastructure, their educational system, their financial system, for that trade to actually be possible. So digital, yes, that's part of the story, but it's part of a much bigger issue around the development of global trade and the rise of emerging markets. And I just add that one of my concerns is that the policy response that we're starting to see as this tepid global recovery rather loses speed is actually people stepping away from global trade, starting to talk about protectionism, about defending their own markets. And if that becomes the discourse that policymakers follow, I'm enormously concerned for what it means for potential overall economic growth and for trade growth, and what it means for emerging markets looking for their proper place in the global economy.
Chris, you're at the hard end of this, the sharp end, if you like. Are you seeing these productivity improvements coming through yet?
Productivity improvements will come. Data plays a very big part of that. Maybe to give a little bit of a practical perspective, there's huge amounts of data now being produced, captured through ever-increasing better technology. And the real trick is what to do with it. So algorithms play their part, very clever people play their part, mining the data and presenting it in a very meaningful fashion from which you can deduce what's been happening to your business and what will happen to your business in the future. And it impacts in two different ways. One way is actually determining how efficient are you from an operating process point of view, and it will impact back into the supply chain. The data is there to allow you to know how you're doing for yourself. The data is there also to allow you to know how you're doing as a benchmark against other companies doing the same thing, and therefore to learn what is it you're going to do about it. Secondly, in the shipping world in particular, it's about marrying cargoes with vessels. This is what is a very large part of global trade. Where are those cargoes? Well, it's in the data. Now, if you can determine what the trade is, where the trade is, the chances of marrying up the cargoes and the vessels is that much greater. And if you think about it, it should actually reduce the cost of doing trade, because the cost of acquiring new customers, knowing where they are, knowing what that trade is now available to us in a way which is very different to the past. So digital will have a huge impact. That change is happening now, and it will only grow.
And then you're nodding your head there.
Yes, well, I was actually just thinking about our experience in Ethiopia with the commodity exchange, and just something as basic as how do you get a bag of maize from where it's produced to the port, and what's happening really on international shipping is what we've been trying to do within the country's transport systems through the commodity exchange, and it's really I think the report focused on this quite a bit, is the Uberization of transport and logistics, and I think we're really on the cusp of what should be seen as a revolution in the making, which is that if we can coordinate shipments, if we can coordinate information. Just to give you a very small example, in Ethiopia, When the farmers used to get paid, it would take 2 to 3 weeks because the clearing and payment systems were so slow. And so our first sell to the farmers was, if you trade through the exchange, you will get paid the next morning, and it's all digital. It's all happening in the back office. And so I was really excited about that aspect of the report. And the other part I think that we should not neglect is that when we talk about digital, we should unpack it a little bit, because I think the report played into the point that, for example, in my country, in Ethiopia, only 5% of the population are internet users. But on mobile, we're doing a lot more than what we do typically on via websites or internet. And so I think the point that in Africa, where internet usage might be very low compared to other parts of the world, in particular Europe and North America, yet you have Kenya, which is now the number 4 ranked country on mobile payment transfers, and the leapfrogging possibilities of having these emerging markets, particularly I think in Africa, the story really around mobile is something that perhaps the report could even go further on, is really looking at how mobile will transform the landscape on system efficiency and access to markets.
That all sounds very optimistic, what we've heard so far. Patience, what are the downsides as you see them? Are there risks?
There are always risks, but I don't think there are downsides really with digital. I look on it very positively, not least because it is empowering people all around the world. You can come across someone in the Masai Mara who is in touch with the wider world. And so although it's impossible to really quantify the impact of digital, I think it's overwhelmingly positive and very hard to overestimate. And one of the things that it's done is, made global trade so much faster and so much more open. I mean, I woke up to this 15 years ago. My teenage son had been on a school trip to Brazil and Argentina. I think the teachers wanted to go. Came back with a very nice pair of flip-flops, lost them, and immediately ordered a replacement pair from Brazil. That would have been unthinkable 5 years previously. So the world truly has become global that way. It's also enabled so many more people to become entrepreneurs. In the budget yesterday, the Chancellor gave a new tax break, a very small tax break, to those who are running their own businesses from home. And that's possible because you can do it on the net. There are lots of people actually making a living as eBay traders and so on. So I think it's hugely enabling. There will be a downside. For instance, when we have autonomous vehicles, that'd be great. They should bring down the cost of transport. It might even lessen the number of accidents. But what's going to happen to the people who made their living driving trucks, driving cabs? So the impact of digital is largely beneficial, but it does hit jobs.
Now, Gautam, the DMCC has established something called the Industry Digitisation Index. Tell us a bit about that.
Indeed. I mean, I'll go back a bit to the CEBR analysis, which said that if digitization is adopted over the next decade, then you could have potentially more than double the number of companies getting involved in global trade, which they're not able to do today. I heard lots of views here on SMEs being able to do that across boundaries. But this, coming back then to this digitization index, we want to take this forward and publish this annually to see how is digitization progressing year on year. And then we probably have to quantify that versus how's that linked to global trade. So we'll be taking data from Eurostat and then putting out that index every year, and we see how that goes. So it's still early stages, basically. But it's not something that has been done before, but it's something that we find very interesting to explore.
Okay, we can take a question from our audience here in London on this one, if anyone's bursting to put a question to one of our panellists. No, stunned into the... Yeah, sir.
Well, I suppose it's two questions.
Would you be so kind as to tell us who you are?
Back up from Senate Partners, LLP. Two questions, really. The first is that digitisation, in the context you've been speaking about, is really it seems to me, an adjunct to traditional trade, as we've talked about it. But in fact, we're moving into a service-oriented world. Trade in the past, and I went to a very interesting lecture about the origins of Swansea and Copperopolis, where coal from Chile was ultimately brought to Swansea because it was cheaper to do the smelting there and because there were specialized skills. And the reality is that you have to ask yourself in the future, to what extent do people in country A actually want and can't get in their own country what is available in country B? That's been the traditional pattern of trade. As we move to a more services-oriented economy, the fact is that digitalization enables lawyers, doctors, professionals, accountants to provide services overseas and across the globe without movement of goods as such. So digitalization is transformative in terms of the types of trade we do rather than enabling traditional trade. And I wondered what the panel thought of that. The second element, which folds on from that, of course, is digitalization of trade is hugely disruptive for governments' tax bases. We've seen an enormous amount of discussion about how governments can avoid their tax bases being eroded as a result of the globalization of trade. Digitalization, it seems to me, will further exacerbate those issues going forward.
Does anyone want to take any of those points? Patience, that second question looked tailor-made for you.
Well, it clearly is a huge issue, and the only way that it's going to be solved in the long term is under the umbrella of the OECD and an agreement between countries as to the most effective way to tax. That's going to be a long time coming, which is why we're seeing governments having to act individually and determine that they will try and find a means of getting companies to pay a fair whack of tax and not go through what are quite clearly artificial schemes to lessen their profits. And we've seen that happen all too often in this country, where amazingly Starbucks seem to be trading at a loss. So we're making progress, but digital, you're absolutely right, enables money to be moved around offshore much more effectively. But I would take issue with your first point. Yes, it's going to enable services, as we're seeing, to move, but I don't think that the need for goods to move is going to vanish. I'm still going to want French cheese. We don't have the commodities here that we need. So trade in commodities is going to continue. Digital should just make it more efficient.
Chris, you take the first point on.
If I take that point on, for me, the big gain is to enable particularly small companies that don't have the resources, either in terms of money or people, to go and explore markets outside their own country. Data and availability of data gives them the means of accessing markets in a way which are quite different to the way it's happened in the past. So if you think about 30 years ago, company A in, let's say, the UK, would send somebody to go and visit another country to explore the market, find out who does what, create relationships, find out what the trade is, 3 months later write a report, and then start to try and figure out what to do. You can short-circuit that entirely, well, not entirely, but you can short-circuit that a great deal now because of the availability of information. And the advantage, therefore, is to the SMEs that Gautam was talking about earlier, because it gives them a tool that they did not have in the past. So for me, this is actually very enabling, enormously enabling from a trade point of view. And I wouldn't see it as an adjunct. I would see it as something which actually will transform.
We can now go across to Dubai and get some observations there from Mohammed Mekki. Are you there, sir? Mr. Mekki is founding partner of Astro Labs. Are you there, sir? I think we're temporarily struggling to get hold of Dubai there. Well, let's.
Could I just make a
Please
point
do.
then on the data issue? And it goes back to something Simon said. In order for data to be useful, it has to be the right data, as Chris said. ONS is terrible, absolutely terrible. Their data is wrong, and they're measuring things like the import of crochet goods. Now, how that can help anybody is beyond me.
And for those in Dubai, the ONS is the Office for National Statistics. Oh, I've far too long to explain crocheting. We'll have a special session afterwards for anyone that wants to talk about that. Well, on to our next chapter head, which is all about shifting power and influence. And the report here looks at the contextual global view of how economic power is changing, which countries and regions such as China and India are on the rise and which, such as Europe, arguably, are on the decline. And we're also looking at the pivotal role of the US. And Simon, I'm going to start with you again here. For so long, we've regarded China as being the motor of growth and the driver of global trade flows, yet we're seeing a sharp slowdown in Chinese GDP growth over the last few years.
I'm not sure you have. I think for most of the last 70 years you've ignored China because the engine of global growth has been the West. And the West went through the extraordinary period of massive increases in prosperity and a huge increase in trade as well. You look at the development of trade, its role in building prosperity in Europe and in the US in that post-World War II period. And it was phenomenal. The China story was a relatively recent one. It had a decade and a half of extraordinarily strong growth, and it's clearly slowing now. It's going through a period of cyclical adjustment. EMs as a whole are passing through a period of cyclical weakness with some rather smug developed world economies looking on and saying, I told you so. They should enjoy that comfort while they can, because the future doesn't belong to the developed world. It belongs to EM. Because the productivity gains that have already taken place in the West are yet to take place in EM. But as they do, as we pass through that period of labour market reform, of education reform, of infrastructure development, of capital market development, of labour market deregulation, and of trade deregulation as well, that's where you'll start to see that acceleration in growth come from. That's where the prosperity gains come from, and it's enormously exciting for what it means for the lifting people out of poverty. But I think it is genuinely threatening for much of the West. We talk about globalization as if everyone wins, everyone benefits. It's not true. The pie may get a little bigger, but there are more people competing for shares in that pie, and I think that's where trade and trade policy is going to become quite so interesting. There will be enormous incentives for those in the West to seek to protect themselves against competition from outside. And I think that's why this next stage of global trade policy is so important. Digital is absolutely central to that, but it needs to be institutionalized. It needs to be part of a broader framework that sets level playing fields for trade and for competition, but also allows EMs to fulfill that potential.
What did you make of the establishment of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank? I mean, this has been seen by many, particularly in the United States, as being a challenge to American influence of global trade via the World Bank and the IMF.
I'm comfortable with many things that threaten that dominant position that the US has enjoyed for such a long time. But I think it will be when I start to see not trade between EM and the developed world deepen and accelerate. It's when I start to see trade between emerging markets accelerate and deepen. That's when I'll know that we're on the right course. That's one of the things that makes Dubai such an exciting trade story, because of the role it plays in South-South trade, in goods and services, and in people as well. Because as emerging markets become wealthier, as they become more sophisticated, they'll both be providing and be supplying goods and people and capital directly to each other, not through the intermediary of the Western world. And that will be great.
Give us the African perspective here.
Well, I think that the report did, favorably highlight something that we on the continent have been observing over the last decade, and really that has, I think, come out as an emerging story, which is that if you look at the IMF recent estimates of growth, 6 of the 10 top growing economies in the world are in Africa. 67% of the remaining arable land on the globe is in Africa, and we're still at 1/4 of the yield potential. So on the one hand, on the supply side, there's an enormous, I think, story that we're going to see unfolding in terms of growth, in terms of commodities coming out of Africa and really feeding the world. On the other side, we have a population of nearly 2 billion people. And I think the projections are that 1.1 billion, or half of the world's labor force, will be coming out of Africa by 2020, just in 4 years. That's a huge trend, a rising middle class. And then I think the other really important point on the demand side is that 60% of the population is below the age of 25. So this is a young, dynamic, growing population that I think we're going to see innovations and entrepreneurship really unfolding in the next decade. So if anything, I'm very, very bullish and agree with the report that the Africa potential is really just going to starting to emerge right now.
Patience, one of the big news stories in the UK lately was that Barclays, which is a business I know you know well, has just said it's pulling out of Southern Africa after more than 100 years, or a lot of African countries. Did that decision surprise you?
It did surprise me, and I think it's a shame that they're doing that, because I would agree that the potential in Africa is huge. It's a very exciting continent. Mind you, for a long time people have been saying that the next decade will be the decade of Africa, and it hasn't quite happened. I hope this is the one. But I think there are other reasons for Barclays deciding to join its horns, quite honestly, which don't have a lot to do with the African economy. I think just to broaden the issue, though, there is no way of avoiding the fact that Europe is losing ground. And I think that the future for Europe looks, for the next few years, pretty grim. Mervyn King has written about another crash coming sooner rather than later, as you know, and that feels right to me. I'm nervous about that. I think the China slowdown is here for a bit longer, and it may be rather worse than we've seen, because I don't entirely believe the numbers. But one of the things that's really affected it is the clampdown on corruption. And so no Chinese business people or government officials want to be seen talking to people from the West. And that does feed through into trade. So it's an extraordinary situation, and we don't hear a great deal about it here. But the number of people who are being kicked out of their roles and in fact thrown into jail because they're believed to have been living a lifestyle that didn't tally with what they were supposed to be earning is remarkably high. So the picture of trade is changing. America, however, remains very, very powerful. But there's a huge question mark over the politics there and what that might mean. It's a real period of flux, I think.
Chris, Inchcape, you're in many countries in what Simon rather disparagingly called the old world there. Is there any hope for for example, Russia it doesn't seem so very long ago that we were talking about Russia as being an emerging market, yet I guess if one looks globally, it is going to be lumped in as part of Europe these days.
Yes, well, we may have a lot of offices in the developed world, but we also have some very some interesting offices in lots of other parts of the world. So the only office we have in Russia is in Sakhalin. And we're taken there because Shell and Exxon take us there because they're developing LNG. We have offices in Papua New Guinea, in Somalia, etc. So we are, as an organisation, more than happy to go to wherever business is being done, and we will follow trade. The developed world woes, if you want to call it that, don't cause us too much trouble. There is still going to be an enormous manufacturing base. There's still going to be a requirement for natural resources to be shipped in, which will drive trade. That's not really going to change meaningfully. You're talking about the changes in growth here, and for that, you need to go to Africa, you need to go to Latin America, you need to go to the less developed parts of Asia. So from a business point of view, I'm not too concerned about what global trade is telling us. I'm more concerned about where we go and the fact that the macro statistics sometimes hide some quite important micro shifts, which are far more meaningful from a business point of view that you have to react to. I'm very optimistic about Africa. Yes, I take the point that the next decade is going to be the big one. But I see change now happening. I see investment now happening. And I think that is going to be very meaningful going forwards. And business needs to react to that.
What about the trade routes? Simon's colleague Stephen King wrote about the new Silk Road a while ago, about these new trade routes from Africa to Asia, completely cutting out Europe altogether. Presumably you must see that on a daily basis.
Well, actually, yes, we do. I can give you one live example of what we've done with the tea industry, for instance. We have a tea factory, DMCC tea factory, which today moves about 45 million kilos of tea a year from 20 plus countries. So we actually, that trade was, all of that tea was probably coming into the UK and then going back into various parts of the world. You short circuit that process, and that's exactly as Simon was saying. It's the South-South trade. Today, Dubai is the largest re-exporter of tea in the world as a result. That's a very, we sit completely at the center of the world of trade, as I say, because we're between the producing countries and the consuming countries, and we have a very large catchment.
Okay, well, let's...
Not everyone can be Dubai. Not everyone can be the re-exporter. There's a role for some, perhaps, on a regional basis to be so. And the Dubai model is fabulous in terms of the value that it generates, but not everyone can go down that path. I think Dubai has very successfully taken that place for the Middle East, and certainly for a growing amount of trade between Asia and Africa. But I would be nervous about putting it forward as a model for the rest of the emerging world. It's not. You need one Dubai. I think Dubai has done very well, but for the others, perhaps that party's over.
We've heard a lot about some of these old trade routes being reopened through the Arctic Circle with new ice-breaking technology. Is that just pie in the sky at the moment?
Is the Arctic Circle pie in the sky? There's a slaughtering of metaphors going on there. I don't know, but I do know that things like the development, not obviously the shipping routes, but increasingly of rail networks and the ease with which that means goods can be moved in large quantity is terribly exciting. What it means for improvements in trade, the speed and cost of trade. I'm certainly seeing that in the Middle East.
Come in on the South-South trade and look at what's been happening over the last 20 years on the emergence of commodity exchanges, which is, as you know, my neck of the woods. And what we're seeing is that the commodity producing countries are taking back their markets, so to speak. So you have now rubber and palm oil being quoted out of Bursa, Malaysia, rather than out of London. More trading of soybeans out of the Chinese Dalian Commodity Exchange than the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And so these trends, same thing with silver for India, coming out of India rather than formerly World Reference Market here in London. So what I think we're seeing is that it doesn't have to be that, it's a re-export story, that everything has to go through a central, port like Jebel Ali in Dubai, but rather that where are we quoting prices? Where is the world, trading off of? And what does it take to build those markets? And obviously that's the challenge we have now in Africa, is that, for example, 4 West African countries produce 83% of the world cocoa production. And yet cocoa is still traded off of London. There is no reason why in the next few years we can't build a cocoa trading platform in West Africa. And I know from my experience in Ethiopia that right now sesame coming out of Ethiopia has a market in China and in India far greater than in the UK. Same thing with pulses. So we could be building cross-listed products, contracts cross-listed between Africa and Asia, and same thing for cocoa, same thing for cashew, and many other significant commodities.
Okay. Question from the floor, sir.
Good afternoon. Oliver Cornock, managing editor at Oxford Business Group. I was interested by what you say about what with dampened global growth, the rise of protectionism. I just wondered whether I could draw anyone on that subject, because it seems to me that there are plenty of emerging economies around the world that were booming and are now not, some that are arguably less mature and less sophisticated. Is there a danger, and to what extent is there a danger of protectionism rising, particularly when we've seen the WTO take a bit of a bashing in recent years, the Doha round and things like that?
Anyone keen to take that?
Let's talk
got
about
patience. Yeah.
the EU and France, for instance. A single market, no, not if you're in the yogurt business. France is very protectionist in several areas. The States is prone towards protectionism in the guise of political certainty, for instance. So I think it was Dubai that wanted to get involved in the port business in the States, and that was not going to happen. So there's a latent protectionism in the world. And of course, when people get worried about their home market, they become more protectionist. But there are some really rather good moves afoot. For instance, the TTIP. It's taking us a long time to get there, but apparently by 2020 it will be in place, and that will do wonders for liberating trade.
Thank you. I think we can hopefully speak to our friends in Dubai at this point. We have Mark Houghton and Christian Hafke there. Gentlemen, are you there? I think the connection to Dubai has gone down still, I'm afraid. Well, let's move on to our next chapter heading, which concerns access to funding, and the report highlights the growing concern over the lack of capital available from the world's banks to support more trade, and looks at some of the reactions taking place with a specific focus on some of the options emerging for better SME funding. It also looks at how new initiatives may play an increasing role in the next decade, especially in emerging markets. Gautam, are you seeing any shortage of bank funding in your part of the world now for business?
To an extent, yes. The SMEs are struggling, and not just across where we operate, but I think globally, the SMEs are struggling with funding to fund their businesses. In fact, the report talks about a particular statistic. In the UK, it says that 70% of SMEs do not have access to bank funding, and so they rely on alternative financing. And it talks about the alternative financing business, which in 2014 was about £1.7 billion, will go up to about £12 billion by 2020. So there is an appetite for SMEs to look elsewhere, A, because it's not available, or if it's available, it's very expensive.
Alex, give us the digital perspective here. We keep hearing about Bitcoin and blockchains and how this is going to kill cash completely.
Yeah, the Bitcoin, I think, is kind of appropriate as we're in Google campus. I find it hard to see how that gets adopted in any sort of in a mass way without some sort of major currencies being behind it. I think the thing that's interesting, and now it's beginning to create it has always had its own identity, but beginning to say it's different, is this concept of the blockchain, of a distributed ledger of assets. It'd be really interesting to see how fast that could be adopted within SMEs, but in theory, what you should be able to have is people who have assets, who have collateral, able to use blockchain as a way of accessing financial products. I think that may be some of the mechanism that begins to shift this. But of course, it's new, and looking at early adopters and how that shifts, it'd be interesting to hear from the panel if anyone has seen that rate of growth and where we think that tipping point is going to be.
I mean, when we look at disruption to the financial space, the whole fintech arena, a lot of it seems quite domestic, peer-to-peer lending, it's all happening on a domestic basis. Do you ever see it becoming multinational in a big way?
Yeah, I think it needs to be. I think, as people here will be familiar, moving money across borders is just really expensive when you think that it should nearly be costless. It's obviously not my area of expertise, but I think fundamentally fintech is very difficult because of the regulatory frameworks that people have to operate in. Just operating the rules within Europe is pretty difficult. We also have, it's obviously a competitive market, we have a lot of incumbents who are extremely powerful, who would rather not have a lot of their business model being taken away by a relatively thinly resourced but highly funded startup being able to come in and do exactly the same thing for a lot less cost. So to me, it's the regulatory framework is probably the hardest thing for people to navigate on that.
Nodding your head a lot.
Well, I think the regulatory framework does make it extremely difficult for this to become trans-border. But there are changes afoot. It's quite clear that the banks all around the world have drawn in their horns in the wake of the crash, and particularly they're not taking risks with SMEs, even though they say they are. I was at Metro Bank yesterday. Metro Bank has grown hugely in the UK. It's now got 700,000 customers here, which for a newcomer, relative newcomer, is pretty impressive. But I was surprised to learn that actually their commercial business is bigger than their domestic, than their retail business. So they are backing SMEs. And in a way, that's a disruptor. Right? It's a conventional bank in many ways, but it is disrupting the giants who've been the incumbents for so long. So there are new ways of funding, but I don't think it's going to be everybody on Bitcoin and whizzing around the world digitally for a very long time.
Simon, what are you picking up in terms of funding for trade right now internationally?
I work for a bank, but I'm only an economist, so I've got to give you an economist's perspective, and that would be, I mean, regulation certainly has increased the cost of funding and impact the availability of funding. And I think given the social and political policy priorities that we have around money laundering, around terrorism financing, that's entirely appropriate. And I'd be anxious if that regulation were to be lessened. I don't think that's the environment that we're in. Bitcoin, I don't care. What I care about is corporates, companies around the world having access to international trade, having access to SWIFT, being able to move money to complete trade. That's about the evolution, but the deepening and broadening of the financial system to make trade possible. And one of the key developments, we do a lot of work on long-term forecasting. We do a World in 2050 report, which I like very much because it'll be 34 years before you can tell me I was wrong. But when we run through the drivers of growth that we expect to see and pushing emerging market economies forward, a lot of it is about infrastructure development, education, healthcare, but it's also about the evolution of the financial system that makes investment possible, makes it possible to mobilize savings within economies, but also makes it possible to mobilize global savings into domestic economies where there's a lack of savings to promote investment. To me, this is key. It's not about the evolution, the radical change of the financial system. It's about making the financial system and financial services available on a much broader basis.
If I may jump in on the alternative financing that Gato mentioned, I think that companies like Kiva.com, peer lending, very small quantities, really across the globe, has been growing enormously. Kickstarter could also give us an example. Just to answer your question, is this something that goes beyond borders? I think that the story is that it can, and that we can get around the regulation. So I'm a little more optimistic than Alex. But what I think is that it also taps into something that we need to talk about a little bit, which is the sense of community, the social media sort of environment that we're in. That we want to lend to a Ukrainian dairy farmer and give her $50 and if someone can assure me that I'll get it back, I will do it. So, and I think that trend, it's not the big corporates, and obviously that's my world as well. But I think there is a story there that is being picked up in the report that I thought was quite interesting.
Chris, you had some comments, I think.
Yeah, for me, there's no doubt there's an awful lot of capital in the world that needs to be put to work. The difficulty is how it finds its way to the places that's needed to support trade. So there's an issue there. I completely buy into the fact that regulation is absolutely not helping, particularly in the Western banking system for sure. Anybody who's got a dollar banking license has to an awful lot of hoops to jump through, and that is imposed upon the customer base. There's no two ways about that. But we were funding an activity, a contract in Somalia, which is not an easy place to do business. And what we found is if you're willing to shop around and find financing institutions who have a different perspective of risk, you can finance it. And so the trick seems to be, I think, from a business point of view, is be prepared to think about who would see this as a good activity, an okay activity, not a risky activity. So if you go to your traditional markets, you might struggle to find financing. But if you're prepared to think a little bit more broadly, you will find financing.
Gassab, do you ever see the dollar being superseded in terms of its... it is the global reserve currency. The Chinese are obviously trying to push the RMB, make it more freely tradable. Do you ever see the dollar being superseded?
Are we talking 10 years from now, 25 years from now?
The Chinese would probably say 200 years from now.
Right. So in the foreseeable future, I think my view is no. I think that will continue. Yes, I've heard views on Bitcoin from everyone, yes. It's never going to take over. But I was, and this is a question I'll open up to everybody. I mean, I saw something about legal fiat, legal sort of cryptocurrency issued by governments. Does anyone sort of have a view on that? I was reading something about it recently. Will that replace the US dollar, for instance? Is this some kind of global currency that will emerge, replacing the US dollar?
If you think of the problems that the euro alone has brought, the idea of a global currency is pretty terrifying.
But a view from the audience here. The Bank of England is backing an experiment. One of the dolphins out there in the UK is putting together a kind of a Bitcoin, but with the backing of Bank of England. It's experimental money. So just as someone said on the panel, so I...
As is Bank of Japan, Bank of Australia, and several others.
Any thoughts, anyone? Alex, what about, we've seen slightly changing tack. The likes of Amazon and Google disrupt every market that they go into. They haven't gone into financial services in a big way yet.
In many respects, possibly because of the regulatory framework, it's too much it's a step too far, not within their core markets. They are interesting companies, not to necessarily go back too much on the previous thing. When we're looking at people adopting digitization and the power and influence, that rise of companies coming out of the US very, very quickly and building brands which are global has been particularly surprising. And the being able to move into new markets very quickly, although there have been geographic markets, has been something particularly interesting. Whether they continue going wholesale into everything that we do in our lives, well, you can see companies like Google are, but not necessarily in financial services. I think that one's just a bit too hard for most people in California to think through how you would tackle those problems.
Any other questions from the audience on this one? Right, okay, well, we'll move on to the next chapter heading then, which is securing talent. And this looks at the double challenge of being able to attract the very best talent to work in the world of trade, and also in ensuring that the next generation is equipped with the right mix of skills and abilities as the elite global nomads take to the fore. It raises questions over how and where talent will align with the biggest emerging trade infrastructure. Rob, I'm going to sorry, stop with you on this one. How big a challenge? Sorry, Chris. How big a challenge is attracting talent?
Twofold. So first of all, the maritime logistics industry is not that sexy. So investment banking, the tech world, that's far more interesting as a place to go if you're young and you want to develop a career. So it's not a natural place to go, and it hasn't attracted a huge amount of interest over the years. And yet global trade requires people who are conversant and understand logistics. The second thing is, if you look at the UK is a very good example. We used to have 5 maritime colleges. We're now down to 2, maybe 1. So the flow of people who have the skills and experience is also reducing. So there's a dearth of talent, and it's not that interesting in industry. So from an industry point of view, what we've had to do, and we've done it already, is actually create our own academies, our own training institutions. And there we have to give people not only the skills to do the work that we ask them to do, but also that broader industry context. So what goes on in the world of trade and how it goes on, as if we are a higher education establishment. And that's the way that training will work, and that's where our internal talent will come from. So a lot of the talent acquisition is really having to sort of train it from within and then retain it.
Is that a failing of education systems?
I think it is in a way, but I think it's governments make choices about what to invest in. And for them, typically, particularly in the West, I think logistics in its broadest sense has not really been that high up on the agenda. You could say that for energy and other sectors as well. So this has been a failing of the last 30 years, and it's not easy to remedy. Hence, industry has to take a hand.
Gautam, how difficult is this when you're competing on a global stage?
I think one of the advantages we have living where we are is that we're able to access the best talent from across the world. And that is increasingly becoming a challenge in parts of Europe, in the UK even, where, and the US, where students go to graduate, bright students, and then are not able to stay in that country. So you're losing that talent, which potentially you could actually use, especially as the population grows older in Europe and the US, for instance, not so much the US, more in Europe. So that's going to be a challenge, but the free market for labor is very good and should happen, which we're able to be blessed with in Dubai, for instance.
Who do you see most people coming to? Where are the markets where it's easy to poach people from right now?
Well, in our own organization, we have over 40 nationalities. So it's very international from almost all the continents.
So you were quite disparaging about the old world and Europe and all the rest of it earlier.
Taking this personally, aren't you? I can
Not at
tell.
all. But I mean, London, we obviously hear an awful lot about as being a global marketplace. What about, does Europe have any advantages in this respect? I mean, people still quite like coming to Europe, don't they, from the rest of the world?
And it has the cheese, of course. It still has the cheese. I think this issue of labour and the broader issue of migration that it feeds into is going to be one of the biggest policy issues for the West to work with, and it's very much tied to the movement of goods and of capital. And I think the question was about the issue of protectionism. The question was raised earlier, and how that might see itself expressed. I think questions around the movement of labour will be the first place in which we see those questions being brought forward. And I think it's going to be really, really difficult for the West to wrestle with, because as I mentioned earlier, globalisation doesn't mean that everyone wins. There are losers, and competition from harder working, better qualified, cheaper professional as well as non-professional staff is going to be a key part of that process. I think the flexibility that you're describing in Dubai is remarkable. It's one of Dubai's big advantages, but I think it's only the first stage of the evolution of the labour market in Dubai. And I think for Dubai and for the Gulf as a whole, some of the really difficult questions about what to do with migrant labour, how to really gain the benefit of its skills and its capital by giving people a permanent stake in those economies, is one of the issues that policymakers will have to wrestle with. Because if Dubai does want to compete with New York, with Hong Kong, with Singapore, with London as a place that people go to work long time, that means giving people a permanent stake in that economy. And at that point, many of the difficult policy issues that we're wrestling here in the West will come right home to roost in the Gulf as well.
Simon touched on the role of policymakers there. Clearly, at the moment in Europe, there is quite an anti-migration sentiment at large among electorates. You know, we've seen the local election results in Germany last weekend. In the United States, obviously, Trump is riding a wave of popularity on a very protectionist outlook on life. How hard is that going to make the role of recruiters when they're trying to get people in from other countries?
I think we're going through an extraordinary event at the moment. You know, we're seeing from Syria migration on a scale that hasn't been seen since the last World War, and that's bound to make people feel nervous. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury has said being concerned about immigration is not an irrational way to be at the moment. And I think you have to try and dissociate that from the underlying trends. Governments, certainly in this country, have been keen to enable those with real indispensable skills to come in. And so there has been a move to make visas available for people who bring technical skills, for instance, and for people who bring capital. But increasingly, with digitalization, people don't always need to move physically. And I think we'll see far more internationalism of employment, but not necessarily of domicile. And you know, we've seen it happen with basic back office, and that works sometimes, and it doesn't always work by any means. But there's no reason why programming shouldn't be done around the world, and it is now. So companies can move and hire in wherever works for them at whatever costs they want to pay. And so markets are opening up on that level. It swings and roundabouts.
Yeah, on that last point, I wanted to actually talk about talent development and education, and how you often see that the labor force really follows also the same patterns of higher education. So as people travel abroad to get educated, they end up staying, whether it's the Silicon Valley or other developed country markets. And I think what we're now seeing is two trends. One is that some of the major leading universities in the West are opening branches or sort of outlets, I don't know what the right word is, but in the emerging markets. So you have the Abu Dhabi new NYU campus, you've got INSEAD and other leading universities all over the developing regions. But you've also got another trend, which is distance education, and an enormous amount of, I think, sort of an economy of education around the fact that you can't move hundreds of thousands of young Africans needing higher education, Western education. They're not all going to be able to move. So I think now we're seeing a lot of development of this new market of people getting an education on location and staying. And that actually has an impact on the labour force not moving or even coming back. And so I think that's also the reverse of the migration issue.
Okay, Alex, or you keep
Certainly
going.
a trend that we have seen probably about 7 years ago. Code fundamentally drives and is the enabler to our business. We have an office in Palo Alto. The development team used to be in Palo Alto. You talk about the competition for talent. It was unbelievable and something we cannot compete with the Googles and the Facebooks of this world. And obviously that is where the sort of centralization of sort of coding experience and talent has been for quite some time. I think now we've seen, because it has been sort of the hot sort of career for enough years now, we've got talent popping up all over the world. We now have a highly distributed development team, so we have people not only in Palo Alto anymore, but across the US. We also employ people in Peru, even though we have no office there. We have somebody in Kathmandu, we have coders in Jakarta, we have an office in Poland and an office in Ukraine that have development teams. So I think that's allowed us to continue being reactive and continue to grow. And so in some levels we're not seeing the migration, but we're also seeing something interesting now, which is people who are living in London. Obviously London has a degree of migration to it. People are still working for us but going back home, so to speak. They're able to move for their own lifestyle choices but still remain employed, and for us they're talented people. We've invested them in heavily and we don't lose that investment. It continues to give us benefit. Again, come back to the point, we were able to do that because the way we have sort of organized our business allows people to basically log in from any place in the world. So incredibly, it's been incredibly sort of heartening to see sort of, and again, we're using a lot of people from emerging markets that actually people have been sort of upskilling themselves and preparing themselves for this particular sort of skill set.
Okay, question for the audience. Mum.
With young people and what they want from business and what they want to go into. It's a bit of a side issue, but thinking of talent, I'm thinking of Ethiopia particularly. There was a young girl there that started, I think it was Soul Rebel, which was a company, fair trade company, and she got people to come because it was a philanthropic company. Are people, the talented, the minds you want, the Google and the Facebook people, are they opting for companies that of course gives them a good wage and a good salary, but do they want a philanthropic element to that company too? And is that something that is worldwide? I don't know, apart from people, obviously the ones we've been talking about for migration, but is that something the young people want now?
Anyone want to take that, Alex?
Just speaking anecdotally, I think we employ a lot of people who are, sometimes this is their first job. I think having started my career in M&A in London, which was as you can imagine, a pretty long hours industry, I think increasingly people are looking for work-life balance when they come into the job market, and possibly the recession, or particularly in London, house prices are so expensive that people just don't see the path that their parents went on or working really hard as necessarily giving them the lifestyle that they want. So I think you are seeing an increasing number of people who do want more of a well-rounded work-life balance, and with that having a sense of purpose. And certainly here we are in Shoreditch. That's the feeling I get when I'm in Shoreditch.
Anything to add?
I just think it's very hard to make those sorts of generalizations. There are some young people who definitely want to be in businesses that have more of a social conscience. And in the UK, I think 2 years ago was the first year in a very long time when the majority, the first choice for Oxbridge graduates was not consultancy or investment banking, but teaching, which tells you a lot, perhaps about their attitude towards investment banking more than it does towards their attitude of teaching. But there are also people who are dead keen to get the house that Alex says is so difficult now, and prepared to work flat out for the most cutthroat organisation. So I'm wary of saying that the younger generation is full of philanthropists.
Okay, let's move to the next chapter. Now, this is touching on a subject on which we've already discussed briefly, supportive regulation, which suggests how different parts of the world see changes in global and local regulation having an impact. And it looks at the growing preference of regional and bilateral agreements over WTO pacts, and also explores some of the opportunities afforded by proactive actions in specific locations to make trade more effective. There's only one person I'm going to start with here. Tell us what you're doing to make trade more effective.
Right. First of all, I'll anchor my sort of talk to the report itself. There was a statistic in that report which says that from 70 bilateral trade pacts in 1980, they've gone up to 270 today. And that's a huge number of new bilateral trade pacts that have occurred. And that's probably part of the reaction to the global pacts not being so effective and not moving in the direction that they should have moved in. Now, as far as we're concerned, where we sit, for instance, we have free trade policy. So basically, trade flows a lot more effectively. It's regulated, but it is free trade with less restrictions to movement. So trade, which is why, as a trading hub, it's always been there for centuries, but as a trading hub, the UAE and Dubai particularly are evolving so fast, basically.
Patience. The EU is on everyone's lips at the moment, certainly here in the UK. How much of a hindrance to trade is regulation?
Well, the single market is not yet a totally fully fledged entity, and there is clearly scope for it to be improved. I like to think that we will take advantage of that scope. What is quite clear is that it takes a very long time to negotiate these pacts. I mentioned the TTIP earlier, that Europe's been negotiating with the States. They started in 2013, and it's not likely to be with us until 2020, which is why, quick plug, I think we should stay in the EU, which has its trade pacts. If we pull out, negotiating new ones is going to be a very long and troublesome business. So that's not to say that the EU regulatory framework is perfect. It's not, but it's better than nothing.
I guess one of the issues, one of the reasons why these pacts take so long is because the regulators themselves get nobbled by special interest groups on occasions.
That is true.
Eleni, I mean, where you sit, presumably you are a regulator as well as a facilitator of trade.
Well, I think that, a structured market is a self-regulatory organization. So to that extent, yes, I'm interested or involved in regulation. But my view is that often regulation follows markets rather than the other way around, and that's how it should be. If you look at, for example, the rise of mobile payment systems in East Africa, especially really coming out of Kenya, the new initiative called M-Pesa, basically these are the telcos that were using airtime or developed a system of airtime transfers that really became the backbone of mobile banking that actually overtook new account creation in Kenya quite significantly, so that now I think 20% of all bank accounts are through the M-Pesa system. I was at a session where the central bank governors of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda basically said that they were baffled for a few years on how to regulate the telcos who had now become financial institutions, and that really they were playing catch up. And I think that's how it should be. At the same time, I think that in the report there was really quite a lot of attention paid to the idea that standards and having a common language is fundamental to really leveling the rules of the game and leveling the playing field so that everyone can participate. So to that extent, I'm not for a highly regulated environment, but I do think markets themselves have their own internal logic. And I think that was played out in the report quite interestingly.
Chris, which are the best jurisdictions in which to operate? Do you ever find yourself pleasantly surprised by supportive regulators?
Probably should ask HSBC that question, but We have a different attitude on this now. You have to go to let's call it the highest standard wherever you are in the world. So let's take the Bribery Act. You have FCPA, you have Bribery Act. Every country has its own corruption laws as an example. But if you're going to trade globally and you're going to deal with global companies who have to abide by these rules, you have to go to the highest standard. So there isn't a good country to be in. And I think that's just going to be a fact of life going forwards.
Right. Simon, a very quick word on you because we've got to move on. What is the future of regulation? Is there going to be more global overreach, or do you see certain jurisdictions moving back into individual lagers?
There's a heaviness that comes with the word regulation. It sounds like a bad thing. You're going to say regulation, say red tape. I think that's nonsense. I think regulation is absolutely imperative to have level playing fields, to have accepted rules of the game, and to have a capacity for dispute resolution as well. I think you're right. Regulation emerges on the back of markets. Without regulation, markets don't function. It's our friend. It's not our enemy.
But do you think that mindset is sufficiently out there yet?
I think it is. I think it's moving that way, and some of the mega regional trade agreements that are being negotiated right now, I think, are evidence of that, because as digitalization makes cross-border trade so much cheaper, so much readily executable than it was before, it requires regulation to catch up. Otherwise, all those potential benefits that come from the expansion of trade will fail, because without regulation, there's no trust. Without trust, there's no investment.
But if I may jump in, when regulation also runs away, and it sometimes does, and I think post-financial crisis, what we're really seeing is sort of an imbalance right now, and I think that's been what we've talked about, choking the banking industry and the capital markets right now. I think then what we start seeing is that markets evolve their own mechanisms. So we've got alternative financing, and then regulation tries to catch up with those alternatives. So it's very dynamic. It's not like one way or the other. I think there is this balancing act that's constantly going on.
Well, let's move on to our final chapter ahead, because, as I say, time is of the essence now. And this looks at system efficiency, which brings together a number of views on the overall effectiveness of global trade and distribution, how it's likely to be improved over the next decade, from the adoption of increasingly open supply webs to enhancing the efficiency of the last mile. It also looks at the role of autonomous vehicles and new and exchange and distribution modes. Chris, I'm going to start with you. Supply chain efficiency, this must be one of your specialist subjects. How well are global businesses adapting to this? How much more efficient are they becoming?
It's a never-ending stream of work in terms of improving supply chain efficiency. That's been going on for 20, 30 years, and there are ever more experts delving into every single aspect of it. So it's not a new subject. It's going to carry on evolving over time. The digital world is fascinating because it gives far more insights, and I think that's now being used ever more. The other element is you may well find some disruptors start to come to play. Someone like an Amazon, we know very well, as an e-commerce company. Then they became a distribution network. Now they're thinking about getting into sea freight and that world. And if they do that, then that's going to change thinking about supply chain going forwards. So I would be thinking that normally supply chain is going to be on a lot of companies' agenda normally, but the disruptors will have a greater impact.
Alex, we should be getting very excited about all of this, shouldn't we? Driverless trucks, driverless cars, drones. I mean, these are all going to drive forward huge changes in supply chain efficiency, aren't they?
In theory, they should do. I think increasingly we'll see things becoming more readily available to us. Whether things fly in or out, I'm not really sure. I think what would be interesting from a business perspective, because those are very consumer focused things, is do we start seeing the sharing economy start happening within corporates? Do we see better collaboration between companies who are better able to access supply and demand? Because we've had sensors and sort of lots of supply chain work has been going on for many, many years. But if you have excess capacity, there's no way currently for you to then somehow monetize that. And so it'd be interesting to see if we get new marketplaces where buyers and sellers are able to interact and collaborate.
Simon, we get awfully worked up in the financial press about the Baltic Dry Index and the fact that it's it's seen as a real barometer of global trade, even though a lot of people assume that because the Baltic Dry falls, it's just because trade's drying up. It's actually more complicated than that. It's all to do with the size of shipping fleets and the availability of dock facilities and so forth as well. There's been so much investment over the last decade in these supersized ports. Is there a danger that they're not actually ever going to be needed to the extent that people thought they were when they invested and built them?
I've absolutely no clue. But I'd say that often in booms, people have a habit of over investing, and you end up with excess capacity and a drop off in prices. I don't know if that's the case with global port capacity, but I do know, again, I watched the development of Dubai up close, and the remarkable investment in capacity that was everyone said was going to be, it was going to be this white elephant, it was surplus, would never ever get used because it was high quality, because it had underlying business logic. It went through a cycle, went through periods of excess and shortage, but it worked because the quality was good, because the business case backing it was very strong as well. And the future for global trade is incredibly exciting. It's pivotal to, I think, the increasing levels of prosperity that we want to see, not globally, but particularly in emerging markets. And for all that digitalization can deliver, you still have to move stuff from one place to another for it to be consumed, and that requires investment in physical infrastructure, in ports, in airports, in rail lines, and in other hard kit to make it work. So in terms of your question, I'm afraid I have no view, but that broader point, I think it's money well spent.
Gareth, infrastructure is still key then, Simon's saying.
Absolutely. Even in emerging markets, I think even if your population grows, for instance, you've got to create jobs for them, but you've got to also build world-class infrastructure to be able to move goods and services. It's crucial.
Eleni, how worried should we be about the fact that Africa is still, it just doesn't have those road networks yet? It doesn't, for a lot of landlocked countries in Africa, they don't have sea access as readily as they might do.
Well, I think that we should be worried if we don't see positive trends. But I happen to think that there are, really in the last few years, quite a lot of investment. And I think it was mentioned that, the investment is really coming in. And I recently, have seen the inauguration of the light rail, the first subway system, or let's say urban metro rail system in Africa, in Ethiopia. There's talk of launching quite a few rail lines across the continent. Ports are being revamped. I think Dubai actually has been Dubai World has been very, very active in East Africa. So I think the infrastructure investment is coming in. It's not coming from the West. It's coming from the South, China, Turkey, Brazil, India. And that's the source of the partnerships that are building infrastructure in Africa. So that's another South-South angle.
Alex, I'm going to come back. Sorry, I'm going to give you all the techie questions here. One of the sort of incumbent technologies or new technologies that everyone gets very excited about is 3D printing. Mm-hmm. To what extent is that going to enhance the efficiency of supply chains and potentially threaten the old order?
I think when you are controlling your own production, it has huge benefits because it's just a faster way of getting something into the production process. I think the one thing that not everyone's quite grappled with is, from an IP perspective, what does this mean for the consumer? We can't. I don't think companies want to get in the same situation we had with music, where because it turned into a digital format, it was very easy to copy over and over, and all of a sudden the music industry really struggled to capture any of the value. You have that same danger within 3D printing. If you have a particular product you're trying to sell, well, what's to stop people basically copying the code and replicating it? And coming back to the blockchain thing, possibly that, because you're able to append code back to a ledger. That may be one way of solving that. So I think it may be some time before we see a company sort of delivering to consumers their products, just because that IP issue becomes an issue. But it'll happen. I mean, we were talking before the panel. I have kids now that are 3D printing at school, and people are becoming much more familiar with the technology, and indeed it's becoming really cheap. You can have basically a machine that can sit on your desk for £400, and you can do it. So I think there's some interesting stuff. I think for a while it will be, I mean, most of the stuff was brought out in the report is around prototyping, and that allows us to do a lot of things rapidly, much more faster than we used to do. How that becomes an end product, well, we'll see.
Any questions from the floor on this one? Sir.
How do you foresee currency wars between central banks impacting what you see as the relationship of trade between emerging markets and developing? Because your value proposition can disappear within a matter of months, and you know, add to that talent immobility between emerging markets and developing. How does that, you know, fit into what you foresee as the future of trade? Because there's a lot of talk on digital, but not enough on what's happening as a policy issue.
Anyone want to tackle that?
I'd agree with you. I think you're absolutely correct. I think some of the issues that we brought out here around digitalisation are key, but it's only part of a much bigger range of policy mix inside particular countries in terms of their capacity to develop value, but competitive devaluations, which have become you know, an unacknowledged set of currency wars between developed economies looking for, not for growth, but for inflation, and for parts of EM as well, can potentially be very disruptive to how that trade evolves. So I think you're absolutely correct.
Sir.
The basis of trade is the companies themselves, whether you are a commodity trader, whether you're a retailer, whether you're a financial institution. We at TMF, sorry, I'm from TMF Group. We at TMF commissioned a report analyzing sort of between countries, benchmarking them, these to operate and incorporate within them. You take, for example, in Dubai, it's become a lot easier because they've automated some of the processes, they've made it all digital. I was curious to know from Chris and Dr. Gabriel Madhin, their experiences within the emerging markets, because when we did that report, the top 10 is filled with emerging market countries in terms of difficulties to set up and incorporate. And you mentioned Somalia there. How do you go about doing that?
Okay, so setting up companies in countries all over the world is something that we've experienced a great deal over the last 20 years. And there's no question you can read all the indices about which countries are easier than others and however they're measured. The reality on the ground is if you find the right advisors, you can often find your way through the thicket and do what you need to do. So I'm reasonably confident in even the most difficult places, you will generally be able to do the things you need to do from setting up from a trade perspective.
I would say that, you know, and I actually sit on the advisory group at the World Bank for doing business index and or ease of doing business, and I think that, you know, there are pillars of policy and enabling environment sort of things that governments can do, and I think Rwanda is probably my best example or favorite story of a country that's really moved up to becoming now in the top 10 of countries that are now in the emerging world, that is, ease of doing business, you know, ranking has risen dramatically, and that's through, you know, setting up one-stop shops, you know, getting rid of red tape and all the things that we know about. But it's also, I think, depersonalizing the process. I know because I now run a business trying to set up exchanges in different African countries, and what I see is that, you know, if you don't know the minister and if you don't have lunch with, you know, the central bank governor, then you don't get anywhere. And so if we replace that with systems that actually work with institutions where people are doing their job, then, you know, then we can really encourage business, you know, coming in and investment coming in. And on that point, I think I want to tie in a little bit to what I was saying about the youth and this burgeoning, you know, youth population, particularly in Africa, but you know, anywhere where we're trying to encourage entrepreneurship. How easy is it to set up a company? I mean, I can sit here and on my mobile set up a company in Delaware in the next 15 minutes, and by the time I fly back to the U.S., you know, the stamped, sealed corporation certificate would be in my mailbox. I can't do that in Ethiopia. It will still take me 3 to 4 weeks to set up a company. And that's even being Dr. Eleni. So, you know, so how easy is it for a 21-year-old to set up a company in their home and get a tax break to do that is really what will determine, the next generations joining the global market arena.
Cheapest place to set up a company anywhere in the world, by the way? Any takers? It's actually here in the UK. Companies House has just cut its fees. You can set up a company here for £10, although there may be all sorts of other repercussions on that. Any more questions? Well, in that case, I'll bring this panel discussion to an end. Our sincere apologies to our friends in Dubai for the technical glitch that has meant that while they may have been able to hear us and even see us, they haven't been able to speak to us, so apologies to them. I'm now going to invite our hosts to play a short video on the future of trade, but before I do so, could you please show your appreciation to our distinguished panellists? Thank you.
Trade is all around us, from the moment we wake, fueling the global economy with goods and ideas, from the most complex to the most fundamental of elements. Trade is about work. Trade is about capital. Trade is about power. Shifting from north to south, from west to east, driving prosperity, creating opportunity, fulfilling ambition. Historic ties, building partnerships of the future along highways on land, sea, air, and in the ether. Connecting millions of people every second, making billions of trades every day, worth trillions of dollars every year, year after year. In uncertain times, trade persists, forging new paths to ensure an ever brighter future, a digital future where the right people, the right ideas, and the right products are forever in the right place. For the right place is right here. We have built a complex global web of interconnected people, ideas, and things. Used in every walk of life, in every corner of the planet. Efficiency, driving growth, driving opportunity, driving prosperity. This is the future of trade. The future of trade is digital.
It is now a well-established fact that the power, economic power and influence is shifting from west to east.
10 years ago, when you mentioned China, maybe China is the factory of the world. However, in the past 10 years, we changed our road.
Africa will continue to be important in global trade as a rich source of commodities.
Over the next decade, technology will become increasingly intelligent, and so will the ways we make technology.
The market research industry has seen huge changes over the last 15 years through the adoption of digital strategies. The way we conduct research now can be done completely online.
Well, the future of trade from a digital perspective is quite exciting in that it's the great amplifier.
The traditional banks have been challenged by new forms of payment. Many of the new electronic forms of payment, I think, can ultimately change the landscape of how these companies get funded.
Digitization, of course, is having a massive impact on workforce migrations with Uber and Airbnb, just to sort of name some obvious ones.
In the context of legal and regulatory systems and how they will need to adapt to support the needs of global trade, we're going to see a struggle.
Dubai, I believe it's in its DNA. When Dubai discovered oil, that was the good news. The bad news was it was not enough. They had to build infrastructure for the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.